most wonderful college history students in the entire world today. Now, if you're with me today, and if you made it through all those stages up to this point, then I know that's been quite a slog for you guys, and I just so much want to just to have been with you the whole time, of course, and working through all this stuff, and not to mention the fact that when I'm with you, I'm more inspired in terms of the way I'm going to present this, and more likely to try to throw in some funnies and fun stuff like that. But anyway, I hope you come to this point with me. I do know that I've kind of cheated you guys a little bit. I've put probably more information, more time, spent more time, than we necessarily would have. But if you think about it, the take-home exams mean that there would be 2 more days of me lecturing during the course. So maybe I'm not cheating you in any kind of way. But this is going to be our last major topical area, okay? And just to do the best we can to finish off History 102. So what I want to introduce to you guys is the post-war era. So these are the America in the aftermath, of course, of World War II, heading into, among other things, my lifetime. And I have to tell you that it's sort of a weird thing, that once you get to your own lifetime, on the one hand, I'm starting to feel old enough that I do think it is kind of becoming history, even ancient history. On the other hand, it just seems strange, of course, you've ventured into your own. And one of the problems is you become more personally involved in it, of course, and you have feelings about what's going on, and it impacts you and personally and all those things. So anyway, let me just give you some sense of the post-war period. So as World War II came to an end, there was a significant fear that kind of troubled primarily the government and the policymakers of the United States of America. I don't want you to think that it was a generic fear necessarily. I mean, I'm sure there were some Americans who were wondering about this situation, but it was mostly those in positions of relative power. And the fear wasn't about the Germans, they had been defeated, and it wasn't the Japanese, they had been defeated, and it wasn't even the Russians, There's an inkling of maybe coming conflicts there, but that's not really what's going on here at all. So the fear was that the war was an anomaly, that the war economically was an anomaly, I should say, and that the United States, after all this war stimulus spending, would fall back down into the Great Depression. I think it's hard for us to imagine how really scarring the Great Depression was, or how much damage it really did do. That half the men who tried to enlist in World War I in the very beginning were refused on physical grounds because their nutrition, their health wasn't that good. It just kind of shows you the problems of the 1930s. But policymakers were just concerned, that maybe the war had been an anomaly, and maybe we're just going to slide back down to the Great Depression. So this became a very sincere issue for these people, and they were tremendously worried about it. And I just want to give you some of the important evidence that suggests that. One of the things that they were really worried about was the fact that there's going to be, well, first of all, war contracts are going to kind of go by the by, of course. But even worse than that, there's going to be about 12 million men. At the end of the war, there's about 12 million Americans under arms. 12 million men coming home all at once, wanting to have jobs, wanting to hit the job market. And the policymakers were like, oh my God, are you kidding? We know the economy is going to slow down at some point, of course, but having all of these men coming back and wanting jobs at the same time, this could be a disaster, it could lead us into a renewed kind of Great Depression. So the fear of this situation was so intense that the United States, the government came up with one of the most socially benign programs in the history of our nation. And it was something called the GI Bill, and the GI Bill is a potential identification for the final exam, implemented in 1945. In the face of all of these men, these soldiers and sailors returning, the government said, we've got to do something about this. And the foundation for this incredibly benign act is fear. They were worried that America could tumble into Great Depression again. So, even though it's a wonderful outcome here, it's based upon this kind of fear. So the question is, what will happen to these 12 million men that are coming back? And the government said, well, we've got to do something to stall them. We can't let them just descend upon the job market and just, ruin the entire situation. So the essence of the GI Bill was to keep these young men out of the job market, buffer create a more gradual kind of movement into the labor force. So the GI Bill would offer a number of things to try to make that happen. One of the most intriguing things they did is they offered a monthly stipend of $20. Pretty sure it was a monthly, weekly or monthly. Oh, damn it. Anyway, let's say $20. I think maybe it was $20. $20 a week. That's what it was for an entire year. And it's kind of like, just come home and here's $20 and go have go party, go lie on the beach or something like that for $20. Just to so you don't have to necessarily do something right away. Take a little break. You've worked hard, of course. You had to be part of this in the trauma of the war. Take a little break for yourselves. One thing I find very interesting is that only 20% of the GIs accepted this. So 80% said no, they didn't want this kind of a handout. So this was really a minimal part of what the GI Bill was all about. More important was the GI Bill, said, okay, let's offer them vocational training, let's send them off to develop, a skill, a talent, a career or something like that. And so one of the things the GI Bill would do is pay for vocational training of various kinds. And as you can imagine, there just became an industry that rose up to meet this. And so truck driving schools and welding schools and things like that just began to appear to attract this, because these guys are all government funded there. And it did actually increase human capital in a dramatic fashion. I mean, they come home from the war, they get a skill, they go out and they get a good job. And it was good for them, it was good for America. So this became part of the GI Bill. It kind of shows the benign nature of it. But the most famous component of the GI Bill was that it would send these young men, if they wished, to college. It would send them to college. And so it just opened the doors for millions of young men who would otherwise not have gone to college. The government is going to underwrite their college education. And it created just a really amazing moment for colleges and universities. All of a sudden they had these men that were coming into college. And I have to tell you, some of the football teams of that era are really amazing. I mean, these guys are 23, 24, 25 years old playing for Army and Navy, or playing for different universities. They should have been in the NFL. But these men were coming in. They were serious. They were focused. They were often married. That was a big deal. All of a sudden you got married students, and they had to confront that reality. So they had to create like what we called married student housing, which is a relatively common thing now, but was not very common. It wasn't at all common at that time. And if you look at some of the way that they confronted this, universities would put a trailer park in there with trailers for the married couples, because they couldn't let them be in the dorms or something like that. And then later they began to build actual buildings for the married students. I was born in a place called Vets Village. Well, I wasn't born, but my mom and dad were living in a place called Vets Village at the University of Redlands. It was a building area made just for veterans of World War II and ultimately the Korean War era. So that was there. And later on, I actually lived in married student housing at UC Riverside. I lived there for about 7.5 years, which my wife will never forgive me for, but it took me a long time to finish my PhD. But those buildings had actually been, I think, built for workers who made March Air Force Base and then were left over. And it was so amazing. Talk about subsidized housing. When we moved in there in 1980, it cost us like $95 a month, and I think at the maximum of our rent, we were paying like $190 a month. After 7.5 years. So, it was amazingly cheap for us to live there at that time. It really helped us out get through that. But, colleges and universities, of course, had to really adjust themselves to take on this wave of these men who were coming in. But the critical factor was that these guys were guys who would never have gotten to go to college. And there's a really good, I think it might have been Ken Burns who did a documentary on the GI Bill. And there's all these talking heads. So these are these guys that are being interviewed. This would have been, these guys are now, and it probably was done in the 1990s. And they're getting older now. And of course, they're just telling their stories. And this one guy, he's saying, well, I was born and raised in Brooklyn. My mom and dad had an 8th grade education. I did go to high school. I graduated. But then I went to the Army, And he's in the Army. He's doing all this kind of stuff. And, he had no expectation whatsoever of getting a higher education. He comes back. He gets the GI Bill. I think he went to Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. And he ends up being, one of the guys who invents like an artificial heart or something like that. What you have here is you're sending these men who would not have otherwise got to go to college, and by doing this, they increase the human capital massively, and it was incredibly beneficial to the United States of America. All these people trained in a variety of skills, all these individuals college educated. When I was going to college, and that would have, I started in the 1970s. I swear to God, it seemed late 1970s. It seemed like all of my professors were these GI Bill guys. All of them were the veterans of either World War II or Korean War, and they'd gone to college, and some of them got advanced degrees, and some of them became professors. So, this is a really beneficial situation. And remember, it was done out of fear. The fear being that the nation could fall into Great Depression, and indeed, people were really worried about that. So they did this. The other thing, and this is a little more controversial, but I do think it's an indication of the fear that American policymakers faced as they came out of the World War II. And that fear, they're fearing that they're going to go back in depression. And they just looked at the war and they said, okay, so what kept us out of depression? And what kept them out of depression was military spending, just massive government and military spending, which created jobs, which created wealth, of course, which expanded the GNP, did all the things that you wanted to do. So some of the policymakers said, well, if military spending is a stimulus to the economy, why don't we keep doing it? The only problem was, what would be the rationale? The Germans are defeated, the Japanese are defeated, why would we build up the military? Well, what this becomes then is an interpretation, economic interpretation of what caused the Cold War. So the idea was, we need to keep spending, at least in terms of the military, and we need a reason for that. So if we can't use the Germans as the enemy, we can't use the Chinese, well, maybe we could use the Russians, paint the Russians increasingly as a problematic entity, the communists, probably they're going to spread to the rest of the world and do all this kind of stuff. And it creates an excuse for continuing military spending. And instead of backing away from military spending in the aftermath of World War II, the United States amps that up, okay? And the United States government builds this incredible apparatus of what became the Cold War. So, you could actually blame the Cold War in some ways on the fear of American policymakers that this was a way to sustain. And it's so tragic, right? Because it puts the world in some ways in risk at the Cold War. Yet it may have been done in the point of origin, just simply to make sure the American economy was strong. It is very interesting, of course. This is the foundations of what's sometimes called the military-industrial complex. This complex of companies and the Defense Department working together, of course, and increasingly, in a symbiotic kind of way, seeing that it benefits both of them to have a tremendous amount of being spent, to buy new equipment and all that kind of stuff, to build new machines of war. All that works out very well for them. And intriguingly, when the Cold War was over, so what's the rationale now? All of a sudden we have the war on terror that begins to develop. Okay, this sort of amorphous kind of continuum of war, of some implied threat. And admittedly, there is some real threat there too, but it's also a kind of a created notion. These terrorists are all something that we continually have to prepare ourselves militarily to confront. So you can argue that the GI Bill is an indication of America's fear of falling into Great Depression again, and the Cold War, really, in terms of its economic component, is also a suggestion, of course, of America, caused by America, this fear of America falling back into the Depression. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. And in fact, what happened in the post-war period is that America embarked upon this extraordinary moment of affluence. It's the age of affluence for America. It's the rise of the affluent society in America. And it's that moment when Americans had so much more than anyone else in the entire world. Here we are living in our single-family dwellings with a front yard and a backyard and a pool in the back, of course. And we've got striped toothpaste, and we've got cocktail in a can, and we've got incredible television, and we got movie, everything. We had everything relative to everyone. In England, they're struggling. England is falling back to becoming like a third world country, and everyone's living in cold water flats. In America, you've got your own big house, you got your front yard, your backyard, your heated pool. A very different situation to say the least. And so, whatever the government feared, whatever the policymakers feared, it wasn't going to happen. The United States was going to embark upon. It was really that, that idea that had come out of the 20s, that they're entering an age of affluence. Well, now it's becoming real, in a very serious kind of way. So, I just want to suggest so why, there's no depression. Why instead was the trajectory of the economy just the absolute opposite? I think I told you 1929, we're looking at 105 in terms of the GMP. 1945, we're looking at about 245 billion for the GMP. By the 50s, it's heading to, relatively soon, it's over half a trillion. By the 70s, it's in the trillions, for the first time, and of course, it's going up from there. Now we're whatever, 22 trillion or 21 trillion, something like that. But, so there wasn't going to be a depression. There's going to be instead this kind of age of affluence, which did have its, little rocky points of recession, whatever, but, entering this extraordinary moment. Now, the reason for the age of affluence, well, there's two factors here, two things. And one factor was simply that the government simply decided that they're not going to let the nation fall to the Great Depression. I already told you that they're going to do that, right? We're going to do the GI Bill. Okay, that's going to keep us out. We're going to do military spending. That's going to keep us out. But the U.S. government intervention in the economy, and this is that kind of, that increased regulatory interventionist state manifesting in a very powerful way, was simply going to say, no, we're not going to let this happen. So through government regulatory agencies, they're going to do their best there, including control over the Federal Reserve, of course, and interest rates and things like that. Through things like the GI Bill, through government entitlements for those that are in need, through government spending, huge part of the story. In 1929, government spending was 2% of GNP. So that means that the government was a teeny tiny portion, their spending is a teeny portion of the general economy of the United States of America. By 1965, it's 20% of GNP. So, and indeed, in the post-war period, the United States government was the number one consumer of whatever in America. Number one consumer of aluminum, number one consumer of airplanes. This incredible consumer that is buying all this stuff, of course, to in large part build up the military component, but also sustain the economy. In 1965, not mistaken, GM employed about 700,000 workers. GM was the largest company in the world at that time, with 700,000 workers. And of course, you guys all know that now. I'm sure that it's like 150,000 at the most, right? Automation and other developments really reducing the number of people who get to work in plants like that. Globalization too. So that seems huge, right? But the United States government in 1965 employed 13 million people. So the government really is just, it's doing everything it can basically to guarantee, there's not going to be a recession or depression. There might be a recession, but there's not going to be a depression. So pulling out all the stops to make that happen. But do remember that even though the government was deeply invested in the economy, it only represented 20% of GNP. So it can't just be government activities that are going to sustain the economy. Indeed, the most important thing that's happening in the post-war period is extraordinary private sector growth. This is the big development of this period. So, people always say, are we becoming socialists? Well, we're not really ever going to be socialists until it's like government spending is 51% of GNP. Then the government then clearly you're kind of in the socialist realm, But as long as the private sector is dominant, I think right now the private sector accounts for 75% of our economy. Government's about 25% of spending. So it really is the private sector development that is going to be the driving force in terms of the economy. And what happened was the private sector is booming during this particular time. And the reason they're booming, and that was an inappropriate use of the word right there because I'm going to mess up my next little thing here. They were primarily booming because of a phenomenon known as the baby boom. And the baby boom is going to be a potential identification for the final exam, okay? Now, let me just give you a little bit of the history of the demography in the 20th century, at least, okay? If you guys had me for History 101, I do a ton of this. I'm really interested in demography. What can I say? But I tell you about the colonial period when you have the fastest growing population in the world based on high rate of natural increase and immigration, and then a continuing kind of activity associated with that in the antebellum period when you still have the really high rate of natural increase. It's based upon early age of marriage for women, unencumbered fecundity, a relatively low infant mortality, all these factors that are really interesting. But the story of almost all of American history is the story of this population growth dynamic. I've read somewhere that if the population growth rate of, let's say, colonial America, antebellum America continued, we'd have like over 1 billion people in the United States today, just this extraordinary population growth. Well, clearly, that was going to settle down to some degree, especially it begins to settle down in the 20th century. But when they hit the 1930s, for the first time ever, the population of the United States plateaued. It plateaued. And it's going to plateau right at about 130 million. And there's two factors going on here. One is indeed the Great Depression. The Great Depression was ruthless on the society and ruthless on the demography. Fewer people are getting married. Fewer babies are being born. So it's really just a difficult time in America. But it's also the result of immigration restrictions. So you've got two things happening here. You're inhibiting, the economic depression is inhibiting, of course, natural increase, and the government policies are stopping immigration, not stopping it, but inhibiting immigration. So all of a sudden, after this era of incredible population growth, 1930s plateau. And the demographers looked at this and said, well, this must be the new America. This must be the way this is going to work itself out, right? So they began to make assumptions that the United States would kind of hover around 130 million, maybe a little bit of growth, maybe not too much. Anyway, well, that notion lasts until about 1945. And then after 1945, it's going to change dramatically as we enter the era of, just laying on my stuff again, the era of the baby boom. So let me just give you a sense of the baby boom. In the 1930s, we had this relative plateau, of course, and low rates of natural increase, and that's going to change dramatically after 1945. And so I'm going to give you decade numbers here. In the 1940s, we have about 19 million babies born, and many of those babies are born after 1945. So it's almost like in 5 years, you're beginning to crank up. At that time, that would have been the largest single cohort for any decade for the United States of America in terms of the number of children that are being born. and Gus wants to play with me. How fun is that? Okay, well, ouch. Anyway, in the 1950s, though, I'm just going to blow it away like you can't believe. So in the 1950s, in the United States of America, there were 29 million babies born. That is still the largest decade cohort in the history of the United States of America, just this extraordinary amount of children. And I have to tell you, that's even more American babies than there were babies in India. And India's got a much larger population. So you just see an American society that's being run over by a stampede of strollers. You know, all these babies are coming into the world. And that will continue on, you know, about 1963 is where we're going to kind of draw the line there, you know, from 1945 to 1963, and this period of the baby boom. I do want to mention to you guys the peak year was 1957, and there were 4 million babies born in America in 1957, and that was the largest cohort of babies born in America up until just recently. And remember that we have ultimately surpassed the 4 million babies born, and that would be in the last couple years or so. But remember, such a larger population to, of course, make 4 million, such a smaller population in the 1950s to make 4 million. But 1957 was the peak year of the baby boom, and November 28, 1957 was the peak day. At least that's what my mom told me, and I'm not going to tell her that she's wrong here, okay? It shouldn't surprise you that you would run into a baby boomer from the peak year. I was born in 1957, you know. And, you know, so there's so many of us. And I don't really think it was like a wonderful thing to be a part of a peak year, a large single cohort, largest annual single cohort, largest annual cohort, that's the way to say that. You know, because we're all going to graduate from high school at the same time. We're all going to want to go to college at the same time. We're all going to try to get jobs at the same time. And tragically, you know, we're going to retire around the same time too. And that could put a real burden on it. We're really worried about, you know, what happens when the mass influx of the baby boomers hit Social Security and things like that. But anyway, it shouldn't surprise you that you run into someone like me, of course, because, you know, there's a bunch of baby boomers, right? Hey, okay, boomer. Whatever that's supposed to be. You can say okay boomer to me right now. Now the big question, of course, is, you know, what's going on here? Why all of a sudden is the population, you know, is the natural increase going up so dramatically? And of course, you know, the kind of ridiculous interpretation is that the soldiers and sailors came back all horny and they want, you know, and really that's not going to work, right? Because the more babies they have, that's going to kind of inhibit their sex lives rather than really expand their sex lives and sexual activities. So something else has to be what's going on here, you know, to create ultimately what was around 65 million. Some people say as many as 73 million. I have to tell you, it's just the number, you know, you're going to find a variety of different numbers that are being presented. And I'm telling you from about 1945, of course, to 1963. And the reason I use 1963 is my brother was born in 1963. And it seems to me, how can I be a baby boomer and he isn't? You know, he's part of my family cohort there. Anyway, so the question is why? And, you know, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on here, but here's my suggestion to you. I find it very interesting that the number of babies born in the baby boom, 65 million, is almost exactly the same number of people who died in World War II. So it's like a sense, you know, of after the disasters of the Great Depression, after the extraordinary disaster of World War II, you know, 65 million people dying, 13 million murdered, of course. You know, this is the extraordinary carnage of World War II. It's almost like the Americans decided to rebuild the world. They're going to rebuild this sucker all on their own, essentially. And it's not just, you know, that they wanted to have kids, but they wanted their kids to live good lives, you know. I feel like my mom and dad, you know, you guys probably know the baby boomers are calling them the greatest generation. And it's a funky thing, right? Because, you know, the way, it's just like us being, maybe we're feeling guilty for not being as good children as we should have been or something like that. But it's more because they lived through the Great Depression, they lived through World War II. You know, my mom and dad were children during this time. So my dad was born in 32 and my mom was born in 33. So they would have been, you know, 7 and 8 at Pearl Harbor, and they would have been then, can't do the math fast enough for myself, you know, in their teens, early teens in terms of the end of the war itself. And by the way, my mom, you know, she lived in the era of Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, she was 12 years old before there's a different president. I always think that's it, you know, that you would have thought that, you know, there's only been one president or something like that if you grew up in that particular period of time. Anyway, my mom and dad, and I'm sure so many other mom and dads, they wanted to make the life of their children better than their lives were. I mean, they had lived through struggle and they had lived through stress, and I feel like they just had this incredible desire to make the world a better place for their kids and provide for their children in a way that they maybe didn't feel like they had been provided. So the baby boom comes along, of course, it creates all these children with a whole bunch of parents who are just desperate to make the world better for them. And I feel like my mom and dad did that. They wanted us to have a good life, and they wanted us to have vacations. They made sure we went to Disneyland at least once a year. Actually, just once a year, so we could